In the 6th century BCE, the ancient world was dominated by powerful kingdoms that ruled through conquest, tribute, and fear. Empires rose by crushing their rivals, and victory often meant the destruction of cities and the enslavement of entire populations. Yet during this violent age, a single ruler emerged whose reputation would become strikingly different from the conquerors before him. That ruler was Cyrus the Great. Within a few decades, Cyrus transformed from the ruler of a relatively small Persian kingdom into the master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. His armies defeated the powerful kingdom of Media, conquered the wealthy Anatolian Empire of Lydia, and eventually captured the legendary city of Babylon, one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. These victories laid the foundations of the vast Achaemenid Empire, a state that stretched across an enormous portion of the known world. But Cyrus became famous for something far more unusual than conquest. Ancient sources from different cultures describe him not only as a powerful military leader, but also as a ruler who allowed conquered peoples to keep their traditions, religions, and local leaders. In an era when defeated populations were often deported or enslaved, his policies appeared remarkably different, and later writers would portray him as a model of just kingship. This raises an important historical question. How did a relatively obscure prince from Persia rise to defeat the greatest powers of his time? And why did his rule leave such a lasting impression across so many cultures? To understand the reign of Cyrus, we must return to a world of rival kingdoms, shifting alliances, and fragile empires on the edge of transformation.
In the early 6th century BCE, the political map of the Near East was dominated by a handful of powerful kingdoms. Vast territories stretched across fertile river valleys, mountain plateaus, and trade routes that connected Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Control of these lands meant access to wealth, resources, and the ability to command enormous armies. Yet, beneath the appearance of stability, rivalries and internal tensions were constantly reshaping the balance of power. At the heart of this world stood the ancient city of Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had been one of the greatest cultural and political centers of Mesopotamia. Its towering temples, massive walls, and sophisticated administration symbolized the power of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under rulers such as Nebuchadnezzar II, the empire had expanded across much of the Near East and controlled key cities along vital trade routes. To the west, another wealthy kingdom flourished in Anatolia. The kingdom of Lydia had grown rich through trade and access to valuable natural resources, especially gold from the Pactolus River. Its ruler, Croesus, became famous in ancient literature for his extraordinary wealth. Lydia maintained strong connections with Greek cities along the Aegean coast and stood as one of the most prosperous states of the era. Farther east, across the rugged plateau of Iran, a different power held dominance. The kingdom of Media had emerged as a major force after helping destroy the once mighty Assyrian Empire in the late 7th century BCE. By the time of its last ruler, Astyages, Media controlled a large territory stretching across the Iranian highlands and parts of eastern Anatolia. Yet Media's rule was not entirely secure. Within its borders lived several related Iranian peoples, including the Persians. These groups shared linguistic and cultural ties, but maintained their own local leaders and traditions. Among them was a smaller kingdom located in the southwestern Iranian region known as Persia. The Persian homeland lay in a landscape very different from the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. It was a land of harsh mountains, dry plains, and scattered settlements. Life there demanded resilience,
and political power was far more localized than in the grand imperial capitals of the West. In this rugged region ruled a dynasty known today as the Achaemenids. One of its early leaders was Cambyses I, a Persian ruler who governed the city of Anshan and its surrounding lands. Although he held authority among the Persians, he was not fully independent. Like other local rulers in the region, he was likely subordinate to the Median king. Around the year 600 BCE, Cambyses I and his wife Mandane had a son. That child would grow up to become one of the most influential figures in ancient history, Cyrus. Much of what we know about Cyrus's early life comes from ancient historians writing generations later. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded a dramatic story about Cyrus's birth and childhood. According to his account, the Median king Astyages had troubling dreams that suggested his grandson would one day overthrow him. In response, Astyages allegedly ordered the infant Cyrus to be killed. Herodotus describes how the order was secretly defied, and the child was instead raised in obscurity by a shepherd's family before eventually returning to claim his royal heritage. This story became famous in classical literature, but historians today treat it cautiously. Such tales were common in ancient traditions and often served to portray great rulers as figures of destiny. What remains historically clear, however, is that Cyrus eventually inherited leadership among the Persians during the mid-6th century BCE. At that time, Persia was still considered a subordinate kingdom within the wider Median sphere of influence. No one yet imagined that this relatively small and distant land would soon become the center of a new imperial power. But the political situation across the region was shifting. The great empires of the Near East were powerful, but they were also vulnerable to internal rivalries, succession struggles, and discontent among subject peoples. Trade routes connected distant lands, spreading not only goods but also ideas and ambitions. In this environment, the rise of a capable and ambitious leader could rapidly change the course of history. Cyrus would soon prove to be exactly that kind of leader. Within a few decades, the Persian kingdom that once stood in the shadow of Media would overturn the political order of the entire region. The transformation would begin with a rebellion that few initially believed could succeed, a revolt that would challenge the authority of the Median king himself. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, the balance of power in the Iranian plateau appeared firmly controlled by the Kingdom of Media. Its ruler, Astyages, governed a large territory and commanded the loyalty of numerous subject peoples. Among those subjects were the Persians, led by their young ruler, Cyrus the Great. At first, there was little reason to believe that Persia would challenge its powerful overlord. Yet sometime around 553 BCE, that assumption began to unravel. Cyrus launched a rebellion against Median authority, a move that carried enormous risk. Persia was smaller, less wealthy, and far less established than the Median kingdom. A failed revolt would almost certainly mean execution for its leader and devastation for his people. Ancient sources suggest that the conflict lasted several years. As the struggle unfolded, support for Astyages appears to have weakened. According to later accounts preserved by the Greek historian Herodotus, divisions inside the Median court played a crucial role. One of Astyages' own generals reportedly turned against him during the campaign, shifting the balance in Cyrus's favor. By 550 BCE, the rebellion reached its decisive moment. Cyrus's forces captured the Median capital of Ecbatana, effectively ending Astyages' rule. Rather than destroying the Median state, Cyrus incorporated it into his own expanding kingdom. This decision proved significant.
Instead of ruling as a foreign conqueror, he adopted many existing Median administrative structures and integrated Median elites into his government. The victory instantly transformed Persia's position in the region. A kingdom that had once been subordinate now controlled the territory and resources of Media. With that change, Cyrus inherited not only land and armies, but also the political networks that connected the Iranian plateau to the wider Near East. News of this sudden shift spread quickly across neighboring states. For rulers in surrounding regions, the rise of Persia created both uncertainty and opportunity. Some saw a potential ally against old rivals, while others recognized a dangerous new power emerging on their borders. Among the most concerned was the wealthy ruler of Lydia. Lydia controlled western Anatolia and possessed enormous economic resources. Its king, Croesus, had long maintained influence over Greek cities along the Aegean coast and commanded a strong military. The rapid expansion of Persian power to the east was something he could not ignore. Croesus reportedly sought guidance before taking action. According to accounts preserved in Greek literature, he consulted the famous sanctuary of Delphi, asking whether he should attack the Persians. The oracle's response became legendary. It predicted that if Croesus crossed the river Halys and went to war, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by this ambiguous prophecy, Croesus advanced eastward around 547 BCE. The armies of Lydia and Persia eventually met near the town of Pteria in central Anatolia. The battle that followed was intense but inconclusive. Neither side achieved a clear victory, and winter approached. Croesus withdrew to his capital at Sardis, expecting to resume the campaign the following year after gathering reinforcements from his allies. It was a reasonable strategy by the standards of ancient warfare. Seasonal campaigning was common, and armies often disbanded during winter months. However, Cyrus did something unexpected. Instead of waiting, he marched rapidly westward into Lydia before Croesus could rebuild his coalition. The speed of the Persian advance caught the Lydians off guard. Within months, Cyrus's army appeared outside the walls of Sardis itself. The decisive battle occurred on the plain near the city. Ancient writers describe how Persian forces used an unusual tactic involving camels taken from their supply trains. The animals reportedly unsettled the Lydian cavalry horses, disrupting one of Croesus's most effective military units. While some details remain debated among historians, the outcome is clear. The Lydian army was defeated. Soon afterward, Sardis fell to Persian control. With the capture of the capital, the kingdom of Lydia ceased to exist as an independent power. Croesus himself was taken prisoner, though accounts differ about his fate. Some traditions claim Cyrus later treated him with a degree of respect and allowed him to live at the Persian court. The fall of Lydia dramatically expanded Persian authority. The conquest brought vast wealth into Cyrus's hands and gave him control of the western edge of Anatolia. Equally important, it placed the Greek cities of the Aegean coast under Persian influence, connecting the empire to the Mediterranean world. Yet Cyrus's ambitions did not stop there. To the east and south lay another immense power. The ancient empire centered on the city of Babylon still dominated Mesopotamia and controlled some of the most fertile lands in the region. Its ruler, Nabonus, governed a state with deep cultural traditions and formidable defenses. Babylon itself was legendary. Its enormous walls, temples, and canals had impressed travelers for generations. The city stood as both a political capital and a religious center, home to the great temple complex dedicated to the god Marduk. But beneath the grandeur, tensions were growing.
Nabonidus had spent long periods away from the capital and had pursued religious policies that appear to have unsettled parts of the Babylonian priesthood. Some local elites may have grown dissatisfied with his rule. For Cyrus, this situation presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Conquering Babylon would not simply mean another territorial gain. It would place the richest lands of Mesopotamia under Persian control and establish Cyrus as the dominant ruler of the Near East. By 539 BCE, preparations for this confrontation were underway. Persian forces moved towards Mesopotamia, advancing along routes that had carried conquering armies for centuries. The campaign would soon bring them face to face with one of the most famous cities of the ancient world. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable moments of Cyrus's reign and one of the most debated episodes in ancient history. By 539 BCE, the confrontation between the expanding Persian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire had become unavoidable. For nearly a century, Babylon had stood as one of the most powerful and culturally influential cities in the ancient world. Its walls were considered nearly impregnable, and its temples symbolized centuries of Mesopotamian tradition. Yet the empire that ruled from Babylon was no longer as stable as it once had been. Its king, Nabonidus, had spent long stretches of his reign away from the capital, reportedly residing in the Arabian oasis city of Tema for several years. During this time, the administration of Babylon was largely left to his son, Belshazzar. Some Babylonian records and later interpretations suggest that Nabonidus's religious policies, particularly his emphasis on the moon god Sin, created tensions with the powerful priesthood devoted to the traditional city god Marduk. Cyrus approached this situation carefully. Rather than presenting himself simply as a conqueror, Persian propaganda portrayed him as a liberator chosen by Marduk to restore proper order to Babylon. This message appears in one of the most important surviving artifacts of the conquest, the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay inscription written in Babylonian cuneiform that describes Cyrus's entry into the city and his restoration of temples and displaced peoples. The military campaign began with a series of movements across Mesopotamia. Persian forces advanced toward Babylon, while Babylonian troops attempted to halt them. In October of 539 BCE, the two armies met near the city of Opis along the Tigris River. The battle ended in a decisive Persian victory, breaking the main defensive line protecting Babylon's northern approaches. After the defeat at Opis, Babylon's resistance rapidly weakened. Within days, another key city, Sippar, surrendered without major conflict. Nabonidus fled, leaving the capital vulnerable as Persian forces moved steadily closer. The fall of Babylon itself occurred shortly afterward, on October 12, 539 BCE, according to Babylonian records. What makes the event remarkable is that the city appears to have been taken with relatively little destruction. The Nabonidus Chronicle reports that Persian troops entered the city while the population remained largely calm, suggesting that the transition of power was swift and orderly. Ancient writers later offered different explanations for how this happened. The Greek historian Herodotus famously described a strategy in which Persian forces diverted the Euphrates River and entered the city through the riverbed while Babylonian inhabitants were distracted by a festival. While this story has become well known, historians debate its accuracy, since contemporary Babylonian sources describe a more straightforward political collapse rather than a dramatic infiltration. Regardless of the precise details, the result was clear. Babylon, one of the greatest capitals of the ancient world, had fallen into Persian hands. Soon after the capture, Cyrus himself entered the city. Instead of destroying its temples or dismantling its institutions, he presented himself as the legitimate successor to Babylon's kings. His proclamations emphasized the restoration of religious traditions and the protection of local communities. Temples were repaired, sacred statues returned to their original sanctuaries, and displaced populations were allowed to return to their homelands. Among the groups affected by these policies were the Judean exiles who had been deported decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar II. According to the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus authorized them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Because of this decree, later Jewish tradition remembered Cyrus with unusual respect among foreign rulers. With Babylon under Persian control, the political landscape of the Near East was permanently transformed. Cyrus now ruled an empire stretching from the Iranian plateau across Mesopotamia and into Anatolia. The ancient centers of power that had once dominated the region were now integrated into a single imperial system. The conquest of Babylon marked the turning point of Cyrus's reign. It was the moment that the Persian kingdom he had inherited became the dominant empire of the ancient Near East. What had begun as a rebellion by a regional ruler had evolved into a transformation of world history.
After the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE, the political map of the Near East changed almost overnight. The ancient centers of power that had once competed for dominance were now united under the authority of a single ruler. With Babylon incorporated into his realm, Cyrus the Great controlled a vast territory stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. No empire of comparable size had existed before in the region. Managing such a large and diverse state required a different approach to rule. Cyrus and his administration appear to have relied heavily on existing local institutions rather than replacing them entirely. In many regions, traditional elites continued to govern under Persian oversight, and long-established administrative systems remained in place. This approach helped stabilize newly conquered territories and allowed the empire to function across enormous distances. Religious policy became one of the most notable aspects of Cyrus's rule. Rather than imposing a single imperial religion, he permitted different peoples to maintain their own beliefs and practices. Evidence from the Cyrus Cylinder describes how temples were restored and religious statues returned to their sanctuaries. While modern historians debate the exact meaning of the inscription, it reflects a broader pattern of respecting local traditions across the empire. One example of this policy involved the population of the former kingdom of Judah. Decades earlier, many Judeans had been deported to Babylon after the campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar II. According to biblical sources, Cyrus allowed these exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Because of this decree, later Jewish texts portrayed Cyrus as an instrument of divine purpose, an unusual honor for a foreign ruler. Beyond religious policy, the empire's expansion also reshaped trade and communication across the region. With territories from Anatolia to Mesopotamia under one authority, long-distance routes became more secure. Merchants, administrators, and travelers could move across lands that had once been divided by hostile borders. The foundations were laid for an imperial network that would later be further developed by Cyrus's successors. Despite his success, Cyrus did not stop expanding the empire after Babylon. Campaigns continued in the eastern regions of Central Asia, where various nomadic and semi-nomadic groups controlled important frontier zones. These territories were difficult to govern, and conflict along the empire's borders remained constant. Cyrus's final campaign likely took place against the Massageti, a powerful group living northeast of the Persian heartland.
According to the account recorded by Herodotus, the conflict ended in a fierce battle in which Cyrus himself was killed around 530 BCE. Other ancient traditions offer slightly different versions of his death, but most agree that he died during a military campaign on the empire's frontier. After his death, Cyrus was buried in a modest but enduring tomb at Pasargadae, the ceremonial center he had established earlier in his reign. The structure still stands today in southern Iran, a reminder of the ruler who had transformed a regional kingdom into a vast imperial state. Leadership of the empire then passed to his son, Cambyses II. The foundations built by Cyrus allowed the empire to continue expanding, eventually reaching its greatest extent under later rulers. But it was Cyrus who had created the framework that made such growth possible. Over time, Cyrus's reputation grew far beyond the boundaries of his empire. Greek writers described him as an ideal monarch, while Near Eastern sources portrayed him as a legitimate successor to earlier kings. Across different cultures, he came to represent a model of leadership that combined military power with political pragmatism. His reign did more than establish a new dynasty. It marked the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire, a state that would shape the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world for generations.
More than 2,500 years after his death, the legacy of Cyrus the Great continues to shape how historians think about power and leadership in the ancient world. He began his life as the ruler of a relatively small kingdom in Persia, yet within a single generation he created an empire that stretched across much of the known world. His victories over Media, Lydia, and the great city of Babylon reshaped the political order of the Near East. But the memory of Cyrus endured for reasons beyond conquest. Ancient sources from very different cultures described a ruler who understood that lasting power required more than military strength. By allowing local traditions, religions, and institutions to continue under Persian rule, he created a system that could govern enormous and diverse territories. That approach helped lay the foundations of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the most influential imperial systems in ancient history. At the same time, historians continued to debate aspects of his reputation. Some scholars argue that later traditions may have idealized his rule, while others point to archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that his policies were genuinely pragmatic and unusually flexible for the time. Like many great historical figures, Cyrus exists somewhere between documented reality and the powerful image that later generations created. What remains undeniable is the scale of the transformation he achieved. In just a few decades, the political map of the Near East was redrawn, trade networks expanded, and new systems of governance emerged. The empire Cyrus founded would continue for more than 2 centuries and would influence the rulers who followed, from Persian kings to later empires that studied and adapted its methods. So the story of Cyrus leaves us with an important question. Was his success simply the result of brilliant strategy and favorable circumstances? Or did his willingness to rule differently give him an advantage that other conquerors lacked? If you found this story fascinating, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which ancient ruler you think changed history the most. And if you enjoyed deep historical stories like this, consider subscribing for more journeys into the turning points that shaped our world.